So we'll be dealing with the blood supply of brain. The brain is supplied by two internal carotid arteries and two vertebral arteries. The four arteries lie within the subarachnoid space and their branches anastomose on the inferior surface of the brain to form the circle of Willis. So this is the brachiocephalic trunk, from which you can see this is the common carotid artery and this is the subclavian artery. So common carotid artery uh, ends by dividing into external carotid artery and internal carotid artery, and vertebral artery arises from the subclavian artery. You can see here this vertebral artery. This is the first part of the vertebral artery before it enters the foramen transverse area of the C6 vertebrae, and within the foramen transverse area of upper 6 cervical vertebrae, it is the second part. Then it loops around the lateral mass of atlas and then appears in the suboccipital triangle, then passes through the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane and enters the cranial cavity through foramen magnum. So within the cranial cavity, this is the fourth part, and in the suboccipital triangle, it is the third part. Within the foramen transverse area of upper 6 cervical vertebrae, it is the second part, and from origin till it reaches the foramen transverse area of C6, it is the first part. So total there are four parts of the vertebral artery. So this looping is very important to reduce the speed and pressure of the blood flow into the cranial cavity. In the same way, this internal carotid artery enters through the carotid canal, then passes through the foramen lacerum and lies in relation to the floor and medial wall of the cavernous sinus and pierces the roof of the cavernous sinus. Here also it forms a U-shaped bend called as carotid siphon to reduce or to dampen the force with which blood enters into the brain capillaries. So these are the two arteries, internal carotid artery and vertebral artery, two major arteries supplying the brain. The internal carotid artery begins at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery, where it usually possesses a localized dilatation called the carotid sinus. It ascends the neck and perforates the base of the skull by passing through the carotid canal of the temporal bone. The artery then runs horizontally forward through the cavernous sinus and emerges on the medial side of the anterior linear process by perforating the dura mater. It now enters the subarachnoid space by piercing the arachnoid mater and turns posteriorly to the region of the medial end of the lateral cerebral sulcus. So here it divides into anterior and middle cerebral arteries. You can see here. So this is the internal carotid artery. You can see the termination of internal carotid artery into a smaller terminal branch anterior cerebral artery and a larger terminal branch middle cerebral artery. This is the circle of Willis. You can see here circle of Willis formed by the two anterior cerebral arteries connected by anterior communicating artery, and these are the two posterior communicating arteries. This is the internal carotid artery and this is the posterior cerebral artery, which is the termination of the basilar artery. Basilar artery divides into two terminal branches, posterior cerebral artery. So here you can see these are the vertebral arteries coming from the subclavian artery, and both of them will join at the lower border of the pons to form the basilar artery. At the upper border of pons, basilar artery will terminate by dividing into posterior cerebral arteries. The branches from internal carotid artery are: number one, the ophthalmic artery arises as the internal carotid artery emerges from the cavernous sinus. It enters the orbit through the optic canal below and lateral to the optic nerve. It supplies the eye and other orbital structures, and its terminal branches supply the frontal area of the scalp, the ethmoid and frontal sinuses, and the dorsum of the nose. The second branch, the posterior communicating artery, is a small vessel that originates from the internal carotid artery close to its terminal bifurcation. The posterior communicating artery runs posteriorly above the oculomotor nerve to join the posterior cerebral artery, thus forming part of the circle of Willis. Then the anterior choroidal artery, a small branch which also originates from internal carotid artery close to its terminal bifurcation. The anterior choroidal artery passes posteriorly close to the optic tract, enters the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, and ends in the choroidal plexus. It gives off numerous small branches to surrounding structures, including the crus cerebri, the lateral geniculate body, and the optic tract and the internal capsule. This anterior choroidal artery is also called as artery of cerebral thrombosis. Then the smaller terminal branch, the anterior cerebral artery, then it runs forward and medial superior to the optic nerve and enters the medial longitudinal fissure of the cerebrum. So here it is joined to the anterior cerebral artery of the opposite side by the anterior communicating artery. It curves backward over the corpus callosum and finally anastomoses with the posterior cerebral artery. The cortical branches supply all the medial surface of the cerebral cortex as far back as the parieto-occipital sulcus. They also supply a strip of cortex about 1 inch 2.5 centimeters wide on the adjoining lateral surface. The anterior cerebral artery thus supplies the leg area of the paracentral gyrus. A group of central branches pierce the anterior perforated substance and helps to supply parts of the lentiform and caudate nuclei and the internal capsule. This is a larger terminal branch, which is also considered as the continuation of the internal carotid artery, runs laterally in the lateral cerebral sulcus. Cortical branches supplies the entire lateral surface of the hemisphere, except for the narrow strip supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, the occipital pole, and the inferior lateral surface of the hemisphere, which are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. The artery thus supplies all the motor area except the leg area. Central branches enter the anterior perforated substance and supply the lentiform, caudate nuclei, and the internal capsule. So one of the lateral straight branch of the middle cerebral artery, which is large, so that is called as Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage. Anterior choroidal artery is called as artery of cerebral thrombosis, and one of the lateral straight branch of the middle cerebral artery is called as Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage. There is one more artery which comes from anterior cerebral artery, so it is called as recurrent artery of Hubner. You can see here the surfaces which are supplied by the three cerebral arteries. You can see this is the superolateral surface. So this is the territory supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. This blue color is the territory supplied by the middle cerebral artery, and this yellow color is the territory supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So the main artery of superolateral surface is this middle cerebral artery, and in fact if it is a left hemisphere, you can see this area will be the Broca's area and this area will be the Wernicke's area. Speech will be affected if middle cerebral artery is involved in dominant hemisphere. So then you can see this is the medial surface. As you can see the corpus callosum here, you can see this entire pink area is the distribution of anterior cerebral artery, and you can see this temporal pole is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, and you can see this area is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So the main artery for medial surface is anterior cerebral artery. And if you see, this is the inferior surface where you can see this is the orbital surface and this is the tentorial surface. So in the orbital surface, the medial part is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery and the lateral part is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So in the tentorial surface, only the temporal pole area is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, remaining part is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. And if you see this entire area of distribution, the major part is contributed by the posterior cerebral artery. So the artery of inferior surface is posterior cerebral artery, the artery of medial surface is anterior cerebral artery, and the artery of superolateral surface is middle cerebral artery. So let us come back. We finished with the internal carotid artery where it was giving 5 branches, namely the ophthalmic artery, anterior choroidal artery, posterior communicating artery, anterior cerebral artery, and middle cerebral artery. Now we'll deal with the vertebral system. The vertebral artery, as I shown in the earlier diagram, it's a branch of the first part of the subclavian artery, ascends in the neck by passing through the foramina of the upper 6 cervical vertebrae, transverse foramina of the upper 6 cervical vertebrae. It enters the skull through the foramen magnum and pierces the dura mater and arachnoid to enter the subarachnoid space. It then passes upwards, forwards, and medially on the medulla oblongata. At the lower border of the pons, it joins with the opposite side vertebral artery to form the basilar artery. So branches. The meningeal branches are small and supply the bone and dura in the posterior cranial fossa. The next one is the posterior spinal artery. So it may arise directly from the vertebral artery or from the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. It descends on the posterior surface of the spinal cord close to the posterior roots of spinal nerves. The branches are reinforced by radicular arteries that enter the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramina. The anterior spinal artery is formed by a contributory branch from each vertebral artery near its termination. A single artery descends on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata and spinal cord and is embedded in the pia mater along the anteromedian fissure. The artery is reinforced by radicular arteries that enter the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramina. The posterior inferior cerebellar artery, the largest branch of the vertebral artery, passes on an irregular course between the medulla and the cerebellum. It supplies the inferior surface of the vermis, the central nuclei of the cerebellum, and the undersurface of the cerebellar hemisphere. It also supplies the medulla oblongata and the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. The medullary arteries are very small branches that are distributed to the medulla oblongata. So if we see again with the vertebral artery also, there are 5 branches, namely the meningeal branches, medullary branches, posterior spinal artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and anterior spinal artery. So next, coming to the basilar artery. The basilar artery is formed by the union of the two vertebral arteries or the lower border of pons. It ascends in a groove on the anterior surface of the pons, which is called as basilar sulcus. At the upper border of the pons, it divides into two posterior cerebral arteries. So the branches are the pontine arteries are numerous small vessels that enter the substance of the pons. Then the next one, the labyrinthine artery, is a long, narrow artery that accompanies the facial and the vestibulocochlear nerves into the internal acoustic meatus and supplies the internal ear. It often arises as a branch of the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. The anterior inferior cerebellar artery passes posteriorly and laterally and supplies the anterior and inferior parts of the cerebellum. A few branches pass to the pons and upper part of the medulla oblongata. So then the superior cerebellar artery arises close to the termination of the basilar artery. It winds around the cerebral peduncle and supplies the superior surface of the cerebellum. It also supplies the pons, the pineal gland, and the superior medullary velum. The posterior cerebral artery. It is the terminal branch. It curves laterally and backward around the midbrain and is joined by the posterior communicating branch of the internal carotid artery to complete the circle of Willis. Cortical branches supply the inferolateral and medial surface of the temporal lobe and the lateral and medial surface of the occipital lobe. Thus, the posterior cerebral artery supplies the visual cortex, most important. The central branches pierce the brain substance and supply parts of the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus as well as the midbrain, the pineal gland, and the medial geniculate bodies. The choroidal branch enters the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle and supplies the choroid plexus. It also supplies the choroid plexus of third ventricle. So the most important thing is the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis lies in the interpeduncular fossa at the base of the brain. Within the interpeduncular system, it is formed by the anastomosis between two internal carotid arteries and the two vertebral arteries. The anterior communicating artery, the anterior cerebral artery, internal carotid artery, posterior communicating artery, and posterior cerebral arteries. And the basilar arteries also contribute to the circle of Willis. You can see here. So this is the basilar artery. So this is the posterior cerebral arteries. And this is posterior communicating artery. This is the internal carotid artery. These are the two anterior cerebral arteries, and this is the anterior communicating artery. The circle of Willis allows blood that enters by either internal carotid or vertebral arteries to be distributed to any part of the both cerebral hemispheres. Cortical and central branches arise from the circle and supply the brain substance. So cortical branches will supply the cerebral cortex, central branches will supply the corpus striatum and the deeper structures. Variations in the size of the arteries forming the circle are common, and the absence of one or both posterior communicating arteries has been reported commonly. So arteries to specific brain areas, the corpus striatum and the internal capsule are supplied mainly by the medial and lateral striate central branches of the middle cerebral artery. The central branches of the anterior cerebral artery supply the remainder of the structures. The thalamus is supplied mainly by the branches of the posterior communicating basilar and posterior cerebral arteries. The midbrain is supplied by the posterior cerebral, superior cerebellar, and basilar arteries. The pons is supplied by the basilar and the anterior, inferior, and superior cerebellar arteries. The medulla oblongata is supplied by the vertebral, anterior and posterior spinal, posterior, inferior cerebellar, and basilar arteries. The cerebellum is supplied by the superior cerebellar, anterior inferior cerebellar, and posterior inferior cerebellar arteries.